Hey everyone, welcome to On Tap. I'm Chris, your host, and today we're going to talk about arguably the most famous brewery to ever come out of Japan, Sapporo. Sapporo was founded in 1876, making it the oldest brewery in Japan. Now, that might not seem like that long ago, at least in comparison to certain European breweries, but you have to remember that in Japan, in 1876, there were still samurai running around the country, deciding if they were going to be loyal to the new Meiji government or go out in a blaze of glory. And by the way, if you haven't seen The Last Samurai, I highly recommend it. Very good film. The Sapporo brewery was founded by a man called Sebe Nakagawa. Nakagawa actually escaped Japan when he was 17 years old by boarding a ship bound for Europe. This was at a time where it was actually still illegal for Japanese people to leave their home country. While in Europe, Nakagawa was able to learn about brewing from who else but the Germans. And the Germans know a thing or two about brewing beer. And this is actually an interesting trend that we see with a lot of lagers produced in East Asia, where the company is based in an East Asian country and usually created by East Asian business partners, but has a certain element of German brewing in the way the beer is being produced. Nakagawa returned to Japan in the 1870s and began looking for a cold climate in which to create his brewery, possibly as a way to kind of replicate as many variables similar to the colder environment he would have experienced while in Germany. If any of you know anything about Japanese geography, if you're looking for cold weather in Japan, Hokkaido is about the best place you can go, as it's the northernmost of the Japanese home islands. He founded the brewery in the primary city of Sapporo, named the brewery after the beer, and the rest is history. Mr. Nakagawa seems to have been a few years ahead of the curve in terms of being a Japanese man in the 1870s, going to Europe and learning technical things from different European people, in this case brewing from the Germans. Because by the time he got back during the 1870s and 1880s, it was becoming very, very fashionable for young Japanese gentlemen to go over to Europe, learn some technical skills, and bring those back to help accelerate Japan's arrival into the modern age. And a total aside, for those of you who don't know, the Meiji Restoration, which I referenced at the beginning, was a period in Japanese history that's very interesting in the sort of mid to late 19th century, where effectively the emperor was put in charge of the country, the shogun was deposed, and Japan started modernizing like crazy. I'm simplifying a lot, but interesting, you should look it up. Meanwhile, the Sapporo brewery continued to expand its operations, become very popular, and after World War II, it was the largest brewery in the country, and was actually broken up subsequently as sort of an antitrust policy by the Japanese government. And one of those pieces actually became the company Kirin, which is still today a major Japanese beer competitor of Sapporo. So by 1964, Sapporo made it to the United States, and by 1984, Sapporo was the top-selling Asian lager imported into the US, which probably explains why it's so ubiquitous on the menus of pretty much every sushi restaurant I've ever gone into. And no, that is not necessarily a bad thing. In 2006, Sapporo manufactured a beer in limited edition called Space Barley Brew. So what they did was, the Sapporo brewers were assisted by Russian scientists in sending up a bunch of grain to the ISS, the International Space Station, and storing it in low orbit for about 5 months. They then brought the grain back down to Earth and used it to produce the first batch of beer ever in which outer space was involved. Price for a six-pack? $110. And I would have loved to have tried some of that beer. But hey, maybe space brewing will catch on in the future. Scientists, if any of you are watching this video, please get on that. Currently, Sapporo is still its own independent company. That is, it's not owned by any large mega conglomerate. And they do pretty good business, producing about 5.2 million barrels of beer every year. And they've got breweries actually spread all around the world, in not only Japan, but also the US, Canada, and even Vietnam. They've actually also got their own museum on the island of Hokkaido, which, according to the company, is the only museum in all of Japan about beer. Who knew? But despite the fact that the company is pretty good sized, they don't do a lot of sort of corporate sponsorship, it seems, especially towards things like sports teams. But there are rumors that they're maybe trying to get in on that game and start competing against companies of the likes of Heineken. And as we talked about in the history, Sapporo still very much now markets itself as a kind of East meets West company. A Japanese company that's nonetheless inspired by sort of a Western brewing tradition, in this case a German brewing tradition. And again, this is pretty common for a lot of currently popular East Asian lagers. And Sapporo also does pretty well domestically in Japan, where interestingly around 2/3 of all the alcohol consumed in the nation of Japan consist of beer. So significantly more than sake, wine, whiskey, especially excellent Japanese whiskey, and other hard spirits. And out of all of this, Sapporo makes up around 12% of all of the beer consumed in Japan. So that's the history, as well as what the company is up to these days. But what kind of beer does Sapporo actually make? Well, their most popular variety that you're gonna find in stores is Sapporo Premium. This is a basically German lager style beer. It's gonna be clean, crisp, but have a very slightly different undertone to what you might expect with a lot of typical German lagers. The company also manufactures a number of other types of beers, including Sapporo Light. This is a light beer. It's gonna be lower in calories and lower in alcohol. Sapporo Reserve. Now, Sapporo Reserve is interesting because it's an all malt beer, apparently, and it's supposed to have a fuller body and more complex flavors than the basic Sapporo Premium. Premium Dark. This is actually the most recent release by the company, coming out in 2016. It's gonna have a lot of the flavors associated with a much darker beer, such as coffee, chocolate, and kind of a heavier, richer, maltier flavor. Now, while you might be able to find Sapporo Premium well enough in your local grocery store, you might have a bit more trouble finding things like Sapporo Reserve and Sapporo Premium Black, depending on where you are. The company also allegedly manufactures a beer called Yebisu, which unfortunately I can't try, as my understanding is you could pretty much only get that in Japan, maybe a couple other places, but it's supposed to be one of the company's more premium beer varieties. So now it's time for the fun part, tasting the beer. All right, so the first one that we're gonna try is the Sapporo Light. Pretty characteristic lager color, very pale. Doesn't smell like much. So, I would begrudgingly say, of the light beers that I've tried on this channel, this is probably the least bad of all of them. It doesn't have that sort of gross, kind of tangy, next day old beer flavor that I associate with a lot of light beers, but it's really nothing exemplary. It doesn't really taste like very much at all. There's this very, very weak kind of beer flavor, but it's very weak. It's very watery. Next, we're going to do the classic Sapporo Premium. Again, this is the variety that you will find most everywhere, and when most people think Sapporo, they're thinking this beer in particular. Let's see if we can get a bit of a head on this. I'm not getting too much of a head, unfortunately. Just a little bit there. Let's see. Yeah, so this definitely has more flavor than the light beer. And the thing about this, and it's, I think, very characteristic of Sapporo, but even to a lesser degree, sort of Japanese lagers like Kirin and Asahi, is it tastes very much like what you'd think of a characteristic lager, but the undertone that I can only describe it as having is, I think, sharp. There's kind of this crisp sharpness that you don't really get, I think, with something like, let's say, a Heineken, which is gonna be a little bit more just kind of malty. If you think of sort of Mexican beers as having more of a citrus undertone, and beers like a Stella or Heineken as having more of a malty undertone, these Japanese lagers have more of a sharp undertone, kind of much more on that clean, kind of crisp side rather than on sort of the smooth side. And I don't actually know if that's something that you want to have if you're eating something like sashimi, for example. I don't actually know. If anyone knows, let me know. Let's move on to our next beer, which I'm very excited for, the Sapporo Reserve. And you can see this is in a very nice metal can. I was seeing about trying to get this in a 6-pack in keeping with my rule of always trying to go for beer in bottles rather than cans. But you know what? This is kind of a cool can, and it was where I was able to find it. Now, this has, again, pretty similar color. I'd say it's slightly, maybe a slightly darker yellow, almost like a more kind of goldish yellow compared to the last one, and a bit better of a head on this one. So let's take a taste. Yes, there's definitely more going on in this beer than in the basic Sapporo Premium. And it does indeed have a bit heavier of a body. It's got a more full feeling to it. It tastes just sort of like a slightly more complicated, malty kind of grain flavor. Sapporo Premium Black. quite a good head on this. And indeed, this looks like a pretty dark beer. In this glass, it's not sort of, it's not like a midnight black that you might see with a porter or a stout, but obviously this is a lager. So it's gonna have not quite, I think, the same heavy body. Okay, so I'd say it's pretty good. I'd say it's pretty good, but I wouldn't say it's maybe as good as I was expecting. The main issue with this is I don't think the body is that interesting. It feels, for a dark lager, and I get it's a lager, it's not a porter or a stout, but nonetheless, the body feels a little thin on this. It does have some interesting kind of classic darker flavors. There's a bit of a roasted malty flavor. I think, little hint of, I don't know about coffee, but I think chocolate, getting a little bit of that. But really it's the roasted malty flavor that I'm tasting the most, coming through. But I think the fact that it's got a bit more of a body similar to the basic Sapporo Premium, and I get it's said here, premium black, so it's probably based on the same sort of beer recipe. Nonetheless, I don't know, there's something about this where I was expecting it to be a little maybe heavier, have a little bit more body to it. To recap, in fourth place, we have Sapporo Light. This is a light beer. While it's not the worst light beer I've had, at least on this channel, that's kind of the only time I've ever had light beers, to be honest. It's still a light beer, very little going on with this, very watery, dead last. In third place, we have the basic Sapporo Premium. This is fine, I think, if you were having sort of sashimi or some kind of maybe heavier food, rice-based, or you're just out with people and you're at a local restaurant, you're at a sushi joint or a Japanese restaurant, and this is kind of what they have available, and you're not looking to splurge on some maybe expensive sake, and you're just looking for kind of a nice, regular, sharp, crisp lager beer. This is a perfectly fine beer to go with. Much beyond that, though, I wouldn't say there's a terrible amount going on with this. It's gonna be a pretty standard garden variety lager. In second place, we have Sapporo Black. This one has, I think, a little bit more going on than the basic Sapporo Premium, in that it's got primarily a bit of that kind of roasted dark malty flavor with just a tiny hint of maybe kind of a coffee undertone, but I would still say there's not that much going on with it. For a beer that is dark, I feel like it's still a little thin, like it has the same kind of body as the basic Sapporo Premium, but it's a little bit more complex in terms of the flavors, and it's, I think, just kind of interesting to have. I've definitely had Sapporo Premium a number of times when I've eaten out, but Sapporo Black, this is the first time I'm trying it, so it's kind of nice for a change. And then definitely, I think, in first place, we have the Sapporo Reserve. This is the most complex of all of these beers. As I said, it's got a nice kind of fuller body, even for being a kind of a lighter beer. By being an all malt beer, there's really interestingly kind of none of the hoppy dryness that you'd associate with a beer, but there's a more complicated kind of grain flavor. So for that reason, I'm ranking this number one, Sapporo Reserve. If you can find it, I would definitely recommend it. You might have, an interesting tasting experience. And I would also say, because it's the most complex of all of these, it's the one that if I had the option to just drink the beer on its own, I would go with this one. So yeah, so that's my assessment. What do you think about it? Have you been able to try these yourself? Japanese viewers, if any of you are watching, how is Yebisu as a beer? I'm really curious to kind of hear about that, and maybe at some point I can try that if I'm ever able to make it out to Japan, which I'd love to do at some point. Thus far, never been, but it's definitely on my bucket list of countries I would love to visit and spend some time in. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Did you know it only takes less than 5 seconds to like and subscribe to this channel? See you next time.